name is Kupfersberger, and today I'm presenting on the Mistress of Animals in the Mediterranean, interpreting female divinity in archaeological discourse. In the course of research I conducted into the iconography of the Mistress of Animals on 2 sets of noble metal pendants in the Mediterranean, I encountered some problematic interpretations of female nudity, divinity, and sexuality. Since my background is in literary and film criticism, as well as women and gender studies, I pay special attention to the ways in which we talk about sex, gender, and the entailments of the female body. Otherwise, cautious authors can unwittingly stray into the realm of assumptions when it comes to discussing sexuality, sexual attractiveness, and gender roles in ancient societies. The inclusion of gender as a theoretical lens through which to interpret archaeological evidence is extremely valuable, but it is dangerous to assume that simply because we are familiar with the concept of gender, we are automatically equipped to discuss it with the detachment required. In 2009, Pamela Geller asserted that a gendered approach to archaeology which disregards feminist contributions makes for a deficient study of the lives of past people, as well as an archaeological practice that increasingly has less relevance in our modern world. She was, of course, following on the seminal 1984 work, Archaeology and the Study of Gender by Conkey and Spector, which first addressed the problem of pervasive androcentric narratives in archaeology. First, a few questions just to set the tone. What do we mean by sexual and erotic? Are these universal concepts which do not require further explanation? When is a naked woman not a sexual object? Could there be explanations for female nudity which don't directly relate to copulation? And finally, does it matter whether or not a deity is depicted on these plaques? So let's take a look at some of the scholarship I encountered related to the Mistress of Animals in the late Bronze Age Levant. I want to say from the outset that the point of this is not to undermine the value of the scholarship or to call out any of the authors discussed. All of these are sources I used in my dissertation, and I hold the authors in high regard. Gold or electrum plaques with imagery of a frontal, nude, animal and or plant-grasping female figure were unearthed in excavations at Minet El Baida, with a similar pendant also recovered from the Hulu Barun shipwreck. The Minet plaques were mostly found in hoards containing necklaces, decorative vessels, and other valuable and beautiful items. These were intentionally hidden deposits dated to somewhere in the 15th to 13th centuries BCE. These plaques have been much discussed, and recently the preferred interpretation has veered from Astarte plaques depicting a fertility goddess to Kadeshet or some other unknown erotic intermediary representative of sexual desire first and foremost. Now, there's nothing wrong with including sexuality and eroticism in archaeological interpretations, as long as we're clear about what we mean by those terms. Stephanie Boudin attempts to differentiate between fertility, sexuality, and mother goddess designations, claiming that the figures on these plaques are clearly sexual, rather than related to motherhood or making the grass grow cyclically. So let's define the terms fertility, sexual, erotic, and motherly. Fertility has 2 senses, one which pertains to the earth and the other which pertains to sexual reproduction. Rarely are these definitions distinguished when the term is being used. Sexual is defined as relating to the instincts, processes, and activities connected with physical attraction or intimate physical contact. The word erotic describes a subjective conclusion that certain imagery is sexually arousing, while the word mother or motherly implies a similarly subjective ideal. For Boudin, the distinction between these definitions allows us to conceive of a goddess of sex, specifically reclaiming sexual agency for both ancient women and for the deity represented here. I would argue, however, that fertility was always just a polite way of referring to sex, like talking about the birds and the bees, and that interpreting these and other nude female images as sexual is neither liberating nor revolutionary. The main reason for this being that in order to find these images sexy, we must look upon them with an etic, voyeuristic, masculine gaze. The concept of the gaze, rooted in Lacan and Sartre, was rebooted by Laura Mulvey in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, to discuss the act of looking as an act of power. She said, "In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly." Kim Binzel, whose work I also refer to in my own, writes of these Mistress of Animals plaques, "Visually, the most immediate and consistent elements are the pubic area, breasts, face, and in most cases, jewelry worn by the images themselves. While the pubic area and breasts certainly relate directly to fertility, a prominent face and jewelry do not. In combination, these features seem far better suited to a reading of female eroticism than the less controversial interpretation of fertility alone." In this interpretation, all other imagery on the plaques is forgotten in favor of eroticism. Binzel suggests that the material and iconographic content are essentially a flashy advert for one's own sexual allure. These ornaments represented personal, private, and highly animated expressions of sexual allure, or kuzbu, an Assyrian term discussed by Irene Winter in her essay on Naram Sin. I'll come back to that essay in a few minutes and to the idea of kuzbu, so keep that word in mind. Concerned with the question of the identity of the Mistress of Animals in the late Bronze Age Levant, Isaac Cornelius determined that Kadeshet, translated as the Holy One, was the likeliest candidate for this nude frontal deity, and other scholars have agreed. As for why she should be identified as Kadeshet, a name not found in Ugaritic texts, instead of Ashera, the supreme goddess of the Ugaritic pantheon, Cornelius writes, "The Kadeshet iconography of a younger goddess is not what one would expect of such a senior goddess." It is in part the offhand nature of this remark which indicates an assumption being made, that a nubile young woman universally lacks power and authority. These authors are making some assumptions. First, Cornelius thinks a powerful goddess should be depicted as an older woman, and perhaps more chastely attired. Second, Binzel assumes objects which depict female genitalia are automatically sexual in nature, demonstrating a bit of an internalized male gaze. Despite the iconographic elements, animal attributes, headdresses, pose, Binzel further asserts that eroticism is the main message of these images, indicating that nude females are erotic no matter what the contexts are, and female genitals are always emblematic of sexual desire on the part of a man. Which brings us back to Kuzbu, discussing the sexual appeal of the male body in her paper, Sex, Rhetoric, and the Public Monument, the alluring body of Naram Sin of Agade. Winter subverts the typical arrangement, objectifying Naram Sin. Not only is his body beautifully proportioned and lithe, but his girdle is tied seductively over his right hip, the masterfully executed pleats and knot pulled to reveal the outline of his perfectly rounded buttocks. Winter discusses the Assyrian concept of kuzbu as referring to sexual allure, but also to voluptuousness, charm, and the emanation of power. It is one of 4 attributes of authority and dominance, along with good form, auspiciousness, and vitality. The idea is that in order to express the perfection and dominance, Naram Sin must be shown to embody these godlike traits. In the present moment, we are saturated with images of sexy women in every medium. Every living archaeologist has experienced a world where sexually objectified images of the female body are reproduced and sold for the purposes of male titillation. And yet, as archaeologists, it is our job to attempt to imagine a world before the industrialization of porn. Even more difficult, we must imagine a world that is not based on Greco-Roman views of women and sex. Most students of myth in the West are introduced to the idea of a goddess of sex by way of Aphrodite or her Roman counterpart Venus, a deity who is derided and blamed for various catastrophes in mythology. In bilingual Phoenician Greek inscriptions from the 2nd century BCE Rhodes, Astarte is equated with Aphrodite, who originated on the island of Cyprus as the principal deity, nudity and all. But she was never only a goddess of male pleasure. She also related to war, copper mining, childbirth, and the sea. Zeynab Berani discussed the phenomenon of the Hellenization of Ishtar in her work by the same name, comparing Western Asian depictions of naked females with later Greek nudes. She notes that Greek sculptors glossed over Aphrodite's anatomy, despite insisting on realism in every other aspect, while the vulvas in Near Eastern art were detailed and emphasized. Disappointingly, Barani too concludes that sex is the main message of this imagery, describing even the rigid ivory Astarte figure as a seductress. The seductress tempts the viewer. Her body is provocatively displayed, and she offers him her breasts by lifting them in her hands, or points to her breasts and genitals. Okay, so here we have to ask, who is the him in this sentence? We soon find out when she continues, the presentation of the female body is a presentation of an object of desire of the male gaze. So here we have the crux of the issue. With or without a vulva, the nude female is the object of male desire. With or without explicitly sexual content, the nude female is always intended to be sexy to a man. With or without a male image, a male is still implied simply by his anticipated arousal upon seeing the nude female. The absence of female genitals in Greek sculpture tells us as much about classical discomfort with female sexuality as the emphasis on female genitals in the late Bronze Age Levant tells us about Syro-Ugaritic comfort with the same. While classical Aphrodite hides her featureless mons in surprised embarrassment and modesty, Syrian depictions conceal nothing, and gestures emphasize rather than hide. But as with our plaques, eroticism is lacking in the pose. In fact, it seems to be the partial concealment and getting caught unawares which makes the statues of Aphrodite and Venus erotic, where Astarte is all business, fully aware of her visibility, but absolutely unabashed. She invites the gaze through her symmetry, as well as through her own direct gaze. In my dissertation, I refer to the work of Ulrike Steinert, The Comparable Body, in which she discusses gynecological terminology in ancient Mesopotamia. First of all, we have the cuneiform pictogram for woman, which, when combined with that for basket or box, very much resembles the abstract puriform pendants found among the Minette Elbida hoard. Steinert also discusses the many metaphors for female anatomy, including house, container, canal, portal, oven, etc., which demonstrate the various metaphorical possibilities for the female body. Kim Benzel calls these plaques metapictures because they themselves represent vulvas while also containing images of vulvas. Iconographic similarities make it worth noting that Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of childbirth, love, and fertility, translates to House of Horus, meaning, in some sense, the womb from which the god Horus emerged. Hathor is also associated with the Menat, a necklace which doubled as a rattle for ceremonial and magical purposes, and which very much resembles the necklace worn by our Mistress of Animals, as well as the Egyptian hieroglyph for gold. Thus, we might read the image as the words gold and woman. The golden one was another epithet for Hathor, as was Mistress of the Vulva, based on the myth wherein she reset the cosmic order by uncovering her nakedness before the ailing sun god, causing him to laugh. One frequently used metaphor for the vulva was a boat, and Ugaritic seafarers seem to have had a special association with the goddess Asherah, whose epithet was of the sea. In the mythic cycle of Baal and Anat, Asherah is accompanied by a fisherman, and at one point she ritually disrobes and casts her vestments into the sea. In Ugaritic myths, this is not a sexual act and doesn't coincide with copulation, but instead seems to be followed by magical rituals. One alternative interpretation is that her youth, beauty, and especially her nudity are her attributes. Might we not consider that desirability is part of her perfection and reflective of her role of inciting desire, which is just one of her many roles? The difference between Naram Sin and the nude Mistress of Animals is that his sexual allure is considered as merely one aspect of his power, while for the nude female, it represents the totality of her potency, even when she's surrounded by or holding myriad animal symbols, wearing a crown or headdress, etc. Interpretation after interpretation focuses on the sexual nature of these images, specifically for the male viewer. The association of female power with female genitalia offers an opportunity to reconsider how we think about the female body, sexual pleasure, and specifically female sexual pleasure. If the pendants are indeed metapictures, as Benzel asserts, the primary identification seems to be between a female deity representative of beauty and power on the one hand, and female genitalia on the other hand. The metaphor of beauty and power therefore seems to apply to both goddess and female anatomy. In fact, if looked at anatomically, the face of the goddess on these plaques is located where the clitoris would be, indicating that the pleasure referred to here is female pleasure and not that of some implied male gaze or anticipated liaison. In myths and poems, Ishtar's sexual desire is made explicit and celebrated as the foundation of her city. Hers is the pleasure and gratification. To an ancient female viewer or wearer of these objects, would they not identify with this figure rather than desiring her? Perhaps they would associate her wondrous vulva with their own. The prophylactic power of this deity is evident outside of sexual contexts, in the realms of battle, sea travel, and especially relating to horses. And finally, is not the female body, like the body of Naram-Sin, capable of containing and emanating power through a combination of forces, only one of which is sex